going to talk about what I think is the single greatest philosophical text in our tradition, and that is Plato's Apology of Socrates. And I'm going to be looking at it in this book, The Trial of Death in Socrates. So the Apology of Socrates is the defense speech that Socrates, who's a real historical figure, gave in 399 BC to the court in Athens, where he had been accused of corrupting the youth and not believing in the gods. And in fact, he was found guilty and he was sentenced to death. But anyway, his speech is more or less his autobiography. It's like he tells you who he is as a way of explaining what it is that he's been doing all his life that has led to him being charged with corrupting the youth and not believing in the gods. And it's his defense. He's saying, look, this is why you should see those charges aren't right. Anyway, I guess the jury didn't agree with him. But anyway, we're going to get from this Socrates' story, and it's very much kind of an exemplary story of what philosophy is. So his story begins in this book on page 24, 21a in the marginal numbers. And Socrates says, I had this friend named Chaerephon, and one time he went to the Delphic Oracle. So the Delphic Oracle was a thing in ancient Greece. It was a major kind of religious institution, and people could ask the oracle questions, and it would give answers that were kind of paradoxical riddles. Anyway, so Chaerephon went to Delphi at one time and ventured to ask the oracle if any man was wiser than I, Socrates says. And the Pythian, which is the priestess of Apollo, replied that no one was wiser. So Socrates says, when I heard of this reply, I asked myself, whatever does the god mean? What is his riddle? I am very conscious that I am not wise at all. What then does he mean by saying that I am the wisest? For surely he does not lie. It is not legitimate for him to do so. Right, so this is Socrates' starting position. His friend got the Delphic Oracle to say no one is wiser than Socrates. And Socrates is very puzzled by that because he does not believe himself to be wise. And so on the face of it, that remark by the oracle doesn't make sense. But then as he says, it's the oracle saying this, not really in a position to doubt it. So that's the challenge for him, how to put together the idea that this claim could be true with his sense that he's not wise, right? So what could that mean? Right, so he says what happened. He said, for a long time, I was at a loss as to his meaning. Then I very reluctantly turned to some such investigation as this. And the investigation he's going to describe is the sort of distinctive and defining thing about Socrates, and it's where we get the notion of what we call Socratic Method, which I'll talk about in a minute. So he says this: I went to one of those reputed wise, thinking that there, if anywhere, I could refute the oracle and say, this man is wiser than I, right? So obviously you're wrong. But then, when I examined this man, my experience was something like this. I thought that he appeared wise to many people, and especially to himself, but he was not. I then tried to show him that he thought himself wise, but that he was not, and as a result, he came to dislike me. So that's the thing that Socrates then does more and more. And I'll read you a little bit more about that in a minute. But that's Socrates' practice, is to come to someone who purports to be wise, and then he examines that person. He says, okay, what is it that you think you believe, and why do you believe it? And Socrates doesn't put forth any views of his own. He just asks the person questions about his own view. I say his because he's virtually always talking to men. Not quite, but almost always. And what typically happens is when those people start to explain themselves, Socrates is able to see and show that they just contradict themselves and they don't know what they're talking about. Anyway, he said, after this I approached another man, one of those thought to be wiser than he, and I thought the same thing, that he didn't know what he was talking about. And so I came to be disliked both by him and by many others. After that I proceeded systematically. I realized to my sorrow and alarm that I was getting unpopular, but I thought that I must attach the greatest importance to the God's oracle. So I must go to all those who had any reputation for knowledge to examine the meaning. And so then that's what he does. So he said he examines politicians, people that we would often hope to be wise since they're, running our affairs. And those people turn out not to know what they're talking about. He said, then I went to poets. They write great poems, and we turn to poetry. We turn to works of art as things that can teach us something. We turn to them as great works of wisdom. So it makes sense that you'd think, well, the poet must be wise. But Socrates says, when I would go and ask the poet to explain the meaning of the poem, poets didn't really know what the poems meant. He said other people around could explain them better. So it's not that the poems aren't wise, but the poets, they don't know what they're doing. And so, as he says, the poets don't really compose their poems by knowledge, but by a kind of inborn talent and inspiration. And so they don't really automatically have an insight into what it is that's great about their work. So then he went on past there. He says, I went to the craftsmen, for I was conscious of knowing practically nothing, and I knew that I would find that they had knowledge of many fine things. And in this I was not mistaken. They knew things I did not know, and to that extent they were wiser than I. But the good craftsman seemed to me to have the same fault as the poets, because each of them, because of his success at his craft, thought himself very wise in other most important pursuits. And this error of theirs overshadowed the wisdom they had, right? So people think, well, I know one thing, and they're right about that, but then they assume that means they know about all kinds of other stuff too. Right? Anyway, so Socrates, as he says, went systematically to the people we expect to be wise, the politicians, the artists, the people who are, greatly skilled craftspeople. And in each case, he found that there was a pretty significant way that those people imagined themselves to be wise, but showed themselves not to be. Right? And so he concludes that, he says, I asked myself on behalf of the oracle whether I would prefer to be as I am, with neither their wisdom nor their ignorance, or to have both. And the answer I gave myself in the oracle was that it was to my advantage to be who I am. Right? And so Socrates says his wisdom then is knowing that he's not wise, knowing that he doesn't know things. But anyway, as he says, as a result of this investigation, men of Athens, I acquired much unpopularity. So, first of all then, that's the basic story of Socrates and what he does. Second, I want you to notice the distinctive character of his method, right? His wisdom is not a matter of him going and saying wise things to people. Right? He doesn't purport to be a teacher in that sense, who knows the true doctrines and is going to give them to you. Socrates' practice is really working with other people to test the quality of their own knowledge. And what he really does is get you to express the things you believe and then reflect on them. And think about them and think about what your reasons are for holding those views. What do you mean by that? To see if you actually know what you're talking about. Now, commonly, what happens is, when he asks people these questions, through the effort they make to explain themselves, they show their thinking to be, a confused mess. Right? And so that's what he offers. He becomes a kind of a mirror through which you're allowed to test the quality of your own thoughts. And that's really what he wants you to do. He wants you to think about your own views instead of just holding on to the views you have because you have them. He wants you to examine your own views, right? He says he examined those people. Well, that's what he wants you to do. He wants you to examine your views and see if you actually have good reason for believing what you believe. And that then is more or less Socrates' approach to being a philosopher. All he's doing is getting people to talk about their own views. And people, through their own words, show themselves not really to know what they're talking about. So on the one hand, he's not actually doing anything. People are discovering about themselves that they don't know what they're talking about. But they get mad at him. So we have this expression that you hear sometimes, don't shoot the messenger. And in a way, that's what Socrates is. He's just being the messenger by which these people find out that they don't know what they believe. But we have that saying because we are inclined to shoot the messenger, right? When people bring us bad news, we often get mad at that person. Right? And here, people are getting mad at Socrates because presumably because he puts on display, or he gets them to put on display their own ignorance, and they're embarrassed or whatever, and they think, oh, he's being mean, he's making me look like a fool. And Socrates' point is he's not making anybody look like a fool. People are demonstrating their own foolishness. But in any case, the result is that people get angry, and you could think to yourself, how do you feel if your views are actually challenged, and if you're shown not to know what you're talking about? How do you feel about that? And that's actually a pretty important question, because if you're going to go to school, to university, if you're going to study, I think a big part of that has to be challenging your assumptions and your beliefs. So there's a pretty important way in which education has to be showing you the error in lots of ways you've thought. In any case, Socrates says that's the thing that happened. But now he's on trial for corrupting the youth. And he says, I'm not corrupting anybody, but this is what I am doing. And that's why I'm being accused of corrupting the youth and not believing in the gods of Athens. And so I want you to think about that. I want you to think about this practice, and ask yourself, is that corrupting? Is what he's doing corrupting? Because he says what happens is the young people follow me around, and I guess they kind of get a kick out of watching people shown to be unwise. And so partially that makes, their elders and their superiors look silly. So maybe that damages their respect in those great and important people. And then it encourages those young people to do the same thing. And he says, there's that 23C on page 26. Furthermore, the young men who follow me around of their own free will, those who have most leisure, the sons of the very rich, take pleasure in hearing people questioned, and they themselves often imitate me and try to question others. And he says, the result is that those whom they question are angry, not with themselves, but with me, and they say, that man Socrates is a pestilential fellow who corrupts the young. But, so is that attitude of, on the one hand, sort of challenging authorities, and on the other hand, being sort of critical thinkers and so on, do you think that is corruption? Miletus accuses Socrates of corrupting them, and Socrates has a little conversation with Miletus, and he says, Miletus says I'm guilty of corrupting the youth, and so I'm going to ask him some questions, and he says he's going to cross-examine him. He says, come here and tell me, Miletus, surely you consider it of the greatest importance that our young men be as good as possible. Miletus says, indeed I do. This is at 24D. And he says, come and tell me who improves them. And Miletus says, the laws. And Socrates says, well, I'm not asking what, who is it? Who is it who has the knowledge of the laws that you're talking about? And he says, the jurymen. And then he says, do you mean all of them? And he says, yes, all of them. And he says, what about the members of the council, city council? Yes, councilors too. Members of the assembly? Yes, members of the assembly. And he says, whoa, then it makes it seem like you think all of the Athenians improve them and I alone corrupt them. Is that what you mean? And Miletus says yes. On the face of it, the way Miletus is answering and the way Socrates is asking, it kind of makes Miletus look sort of silly. Miletus just doesn't seem to have a good answer to who's educating the people, and it seems, as Socrates says, it sounds kind of ridiculous when everybody's helping these people and he alone is corrupting them. And he says that in the next paragraph. He says he doesn't think this sounds really true, and he says, well, does this apply to horses, do you think, that all men improve them and one individual corrupts them? And he says, no, I think the contrary is true, that one individual is able to improve them, or at least very few, namely the horse breeders who really know how. So most people wouldn't know how to improve a horse, right? So the first thing I want you to think about is that exchange and sort of the plausibility of the thing Socrates says, right? That it does make it seem like Miletus hasn't really thought about what it takes to make people good or bad. And there's something kind of ridiculous in saying that Socrates is this one guy who's going around corrupting them all. And that doesn't really look like what we normally imagine education to be, right? To think about training horses. It's rather, most people wouldn't know what to do at all, but only a person with really specialized knowledge of, what horses are like can train them. So that's his first response to Miletus that makes it look like it's not really very plausible, the charge he's made, and that indeed Miletus really is just reflecting this anger that Socrates is saying, has developed around him. But then I want you to think, on the other hand, I'm not sure that Socrates' response there is that convincing, because So Meletus says all the people are, help and you corrupt. And Socrates says, would that be true with horses? And I think in a way the answer would be yes. Like, how do horses normally learn to be good at being horses? Well, it's not by being surrounded by a bunch of people, but by being surrounded by other horses, right? Horses learn how to be horses by hanging around with horses. Puppies learn how to be dogs by hanging around with dogs. Wolves learn how to be wolves by hanging around with wolves, right? There's something that seems to me actually quite sensible in Meletus's answer, that the way we learn to be good people is by hanging around with people. And so in a way the whole society is educating us. And so there is something pretty singular that Socrates is doing by coming out and challenging views and getting other people to do the same. So so what I want to bring out there is that there really is an issue here. It's not one that requires no thought. You have to think for yourself. Is that kind of thing that Socrates is calling for when he says you should examine your beliefs, is that corruption or not? I mean, generally speaking, those of us who practice the discipline of philosophy think, no, that's not corruption. That's what you should do. We need to be philosophical. We need to reflect on our own views and figure out which of the things we believe are just prejudices and what are the things we believe with good reason. But there is something pretty powerful about the idea that approach is not a gentle or neutral approach. That issue of philosophical questioning really does challenge many of the views that people grow up with and carry forward. So it makes sense to call it corrupting in the sense that philosophy doesn't let things carry on just because they're tradition. Philosophy really sort of pokes the hole in the balloon of a lot of ways that people live. And so in that sense, it's very oppositional and undermining to sort of existing forms of cultural life. And I wanted on that point to compare this with something that we saw in the Buddha. Remember that the Buddha says about himself, this is on page 6 from the Discourse on the Noble Quest in in early Buddhist philosophy. He says, "When I was a young man, with my unwilling parents wailing tearfully, I shaved off my hair and donned yellow robes, and I went forth from home into homelessness." Right? So the story of the Buddha is that, traditionally they say at the age of 29, he abandoned his home life. He left his parents and he left his wife and child and said, I'm going off away from the world of home life, which he says is dusty, by which he means it's got all these things that kind of hold your soul back, all these kinds of weights. He said, I went back from that to go try to release myself from prejudice and whatever else and to gain enlightenment. But so the Buddha going from home into homelessness really left behind all the world of established values, family, wealth, tradition, traditional religion. He left all those things to go figure out for himself what the right way to live was. Right, so that's very similar to the kind of thing that Socrates is doing. And I want to emphasize that leaving behind of the established world of home to bring out that side of, corruption, that sense of challenging the established order. And the Buddha says that again, actually, in the discourse to Sigala. Remember, Sigala is a householder's son. He's just like a normal guy. And he's going out, and the Buddha says, what are you doing? He says, I'm going out to pray to the four directions the way my dad told me. He said, I'm doing it out of honor, respect, esteem, and reverence for the words of my father. It's on page 193 of this book. And the Buddha says that's not really the way to worship. And so what the Buddha does is say, effectively, you're performing these sort of established rituals, and they don't really mean that much. You really should sort of worship the compass points of our life, but the compass points are our profound human relationships, our relationship to parents or to children, to wife and child. He's assuming he's talking to a man in this discourse. Wife and child, to friends and companions, and so on. He says, you've got to find the basic human relationships that kind of define you. And it's rather than sort of, uh, wetting your hair and bowing down and making certain bodily gestures, the way you worship them is by bringing to them the appropriate degree of commitment and compassion. And so he's really saying, like, you have to replace performing those traditional things which you do out of, reverence for your father, with a self-critical reflection on what really matters in human life, and you need to respond to those things kind of insightfully. Well, so that the thing the Buddha is saying there, in many ways, is very similar to the things Socrates is saying, but especially in this way of being a challenge to the existing order. So I wanted to just focus for a minute then on that charge of corrupting the youth, to show, or to try to show a little bit about why that charge makes sense, and where you have to really see that the choice to be philosophical, the decision to be philosophical, reflects a fundamental value that in a significant way is oppositional to other things people commonly accept in life. Now, Socrates says he's not corrupting the youth. He doesn't believe that at all. In fact, he thinks he's providing the greatest service, because, as he says at the very end, this is after he's been sentenced to death. This is on page 39 of this book. This is 38a. He says, I say that it is the greatest good for a man to discuss virtue every day, and to discuss those other things about which you hear me conversing and testing myself and others. For the unexamined life is not worth living for men. So Socrates then thinks that this act of examination, self-examination, where we really test our values and try to figure out if they're right or not, that's not corruption. That is actually sort of the fulfillment of our human nature. That's the good for men that makes a human life really worth living. That's where we really accomplish our distinctive humanity. Socrates says at 30e that he's been a kind of gadfly, a little fly that runs around stinging horses. He says, I was attached to this city as upon a great and noble horse, which was somewhat sluggish because of its size and needed to be stirred up by a kind of gadfly. Right? So his image is that he's a guy who goes around stinging a kind of sleeping horse. Right? And he says that at 31a. He says, you might easily be annoyed with me as people are when they are aroused from a doze. Right? So he's saying, it's like people are sleeping, and what he's doing in asking these questions is kind of getting people to wake up. But, so sometimes you don't like to be brought out of your sleep. But so notice then that he's saying that the very nature of people, like if the unexamined life is not worth living for a human being, right? If it's the good for human beings is to talk about virtue and so on every day, then he's saying there's something distinctive about our humanity that is only realized when we sort of take those questions of ultimate value and, really think about them, when we take our own views and really question them, when we care about whether we've got things right or not, right? And so in that way, people, as Socrates is understanding them, are different from what I was saying about horses, right? I was saying, horses really do learn how to be horses just by hanging around with other horses. That's how they become good horses. But that's not how people become good people. It may be part of it. But he's saying there's something you have to do as an individual too. And that is, you have to be self-critical in your views. Nobody else can do it for you. You got to think for yourself. Again, very much like some of the things the Buddha said. But so, that's then the thing about human beings. We're the kind of being, unlike a horse, that has the capacity to critically reflect on our own views, and indeed has the responsibility to do that, right? And so that idea that the human being is the particular kind of animal, the particular kind of thing that occurs in the world that also has this ability to take account of itself, that was summarized by Aristotle, who was a student of Plato's, by saying that the human being is the animal with logos. Logos is basically the word that means sort of to give an account of something, right? And so we are the animals who can give an account of ourselves, right? And that's the language Socrates uses when he's, talking about people getting upset. And he said, you guys, in fact, you guys sentenced me to death because you think you're going to get away with not having to give an account of your life. He said, you did this in the belief that you would avoid giving an account of your life. Whereas Socrates is saying that's what you really got to do. You've got to be able to account for yourself. You got to be accountable. Right, and so I like that expression that the human being is the animal with logos, the animal that can give an account, as the kind of thing that defines the human being, but then also says something about what it takes for us to be good at being people. And so Socrates says, that's really what he's been doing. He's just been going around trying to encourage people to be good people. So he says, if you guys said, well, Socrates, we'll acquit you, we'll let you off these charges if you promise to stop going around and don't practice philosophy anymore. He says, men of Athens, this is what I would say to you. Men of Athens, I'm grateful and I am your friend, but I will obey the god rather than you. The god because he's responding to the Delphic oracle. And as long as I draw breath and am able, I shall not cease to practice philosophy, to exhort you, and in my usual way to point out to any one of you whom I happen to meet, good sir, you are an Athenian, a citizen of the greatest city with the greatest reputation for wisdom and power. Are you not ashamed of your eagerness to possess as much wealth, reputation, and honors as possible, while you do not care for, nor give thought to wisdom or truth, or the best possible state of your soul? Right? So Socrates is saying, that's really what he understands his philosophizing to be about. It's about being someone who encourages other people to care about the health of their soul, which really means to care about being good rather than trying to get rich and famous and so on. Right? And that notion of caring for honors and wealth and so on should remind you again of the Buddha talking about the ignoble quest, where we try to make our lives sort of successful by trying to grab on to things that are themselves characterized by birth and death and impurity and so on. And whereas the Buddha says, no, we want to go for the noble quest. Right? Socrates is saying something quite similar here. He's saying the thing he's trying to get people to wake up from is the idea that they can do a good job by just getting rich and famous. Where he says, no, you got to really care about being good. You got to care about the health of your soul, which he also says at the end when he says, what I want you to do, I'm going to be put to death, but I want you to, exhort my sons afterwards. And he says, when my sons grow up, if you think they care for money or anything else more than they care for virtue, then you should reproach them. Right? So that's the real thing Socrates is after. He wants you to reflect on your own views. He wants you to be self-critical rather than just sort of going along with the flow. And that practice is part of the quest to be good and to become someone virtuous, as opposed to someone who's just trying to accumulate the things of this world, getting rich and famous and so on. So that's all I really wanted to bring out of this. I wanted to try to bring out the basic character of Socrates' practice and what he's after, and to bring that out in relationship to this trial to see why this is not socially and politically neutral, and also to try to bring out a few of those parallels with the Buddha. Next time, we will move on to talking about his great speech in the Phaedrus, and we'll start to see the significance of this for talking about relationships, especially sexual or erotic life.